All right. Hey, Cody, how's it going?
Doing great. How are you, Aiden?
Oh, I am good. We've known each other for a long time. I think, oh gosh, now I'm gonna like it's been like 5 years, I think, something like that,
A few
maybe more than
minutes. I
that.
mean, if we count COVID as a decade, because it feels like
Yep.
one, we've known each other for like 15 years,
Yeah. So there you go. We've known each other for a little bit, quite a while.
a little bit of time.
And we met at Briarcrest when you were. What were you doing at the time? Were you the? I don't even know what you were doing. I don't think you weren't the chaplain yet. You were just hanging out doing music stuff, I think.
Yeah, I was doing a sort of a mixed bag of things at that point in time. I was doing
Yeah.
work at Briarcrest in the student development department. I was doing work in the worship arts department, and I was doing some stuff with recruitment and marketing, sort of all three.
And so how we met was at the time I was a second year, and I realized that I needed mentorship and discipleship really badly. That in the first year I just had none of it, and it was like a point where it's like, okay, I know this isn't healthy. So then I was like, I don't even know who to ask. And I was talking to my roommate Colton, and he was like, you should ask Cody. And I was like, okay, I don't really know Cody, but I'll just ask him if he wants to go for coffee or hang out or whatever. And then at the end, I'll like say, hey, do you want to do this more than just once? So we did that. And at the end, you were super gracious and like, yeah, totally. And so we've been doing it ever since, even like away from Briarcrest, we still are constantly in communication. So just want to thank you for that. It's been amazing. And you've been super helpful for me with understanding like the Bible and Christianity. And you've taken me from more of like a fundamentalist Baptist to now being, I don't know what, I guess I'll just call myself a Jesus follower. But for
Yeah, a
those who don't know
centrist.
anything,
Yeah, a Jesus,
there we
a
go.
Jesus following centrist.
But for those who don't know who you are, because I know you quite a bit, can you just intro yourself, like who you are, what you're up to, what life's been like for you in COVID?
Yeah. So, many people who probably listen to this podcast or who are friends of yours who know me would probably know me best from my time working at Briarcrest College and Seminary, which is, as many know, but if you don't, a small sort of, as they say, liberal arts Bible college, truly in the middle of nowhere, Saskatchewan. And I worked there as a sort of like campus pastor, doing spiritual formation work, a little bit of adjunct faculty work. So I worked there for about 5 years, and that was coming off having finished a degree there in Bible, a biblical studies degree. Greek was my sort of language of choice. And I sort of mention that now because I know we're going to get into chatting about languages a little bit later as we talk about what this strange thing is that we all, at least as Christians, call the Bible. But anyway, following those around 5 years at Briarcrest, my wife and I moved here to Calgary in 2019. And a couple of things happened there. One was to plant a church. And, we didn't really know that a global pandemic was on the horizon. And so
Yeah.
like a wide-eyed church planter, we moved and everything sort of got shut down. So that all that's really been on pause for us. But I work with varying organizations here in Calgary. One of which is I work at a ministry school here in the city and doing some stuff with something called Tequila, which has a pretty long history here in the city, about 30 years. And at the same time we moved here, I started my Master's of Arts in New Testament. And so this is a little bit confusing, but I'm based in Calgary, but I'm doing my MA out of a school in Chicago. And I work very closely there as a TA for two different faculty members. One is called Scott McKnight. He's a really famous New Testament scholar. And the other one is also quite famous, although people might not be familiar with him. His name's Nijay Gupta. And so I have this incredible privilege. I work really closely with these two New Testament scholars, and I get to work on projects with them, and I'm working on my MA. And so I live in this interesting nexus point of I'm even preparing and working towards PhD studies in New Testament and Bible. So I'm doing a lot of prep work for that now. But then more than that, I also exist in a lot of church circles. And so I am in this really weird point, which I think in our modern context is a very strange position to hold. Although in the history of the church, it's much more common for someone to be, a Bible scholar, theologian who also is with normal human beings. And the funny thing about these two worlds, and then I'll turn it back over to you, is the funny thing about both these worlds is there's very different questions and very different kinds of conversations that happen in these worlds. And you're exposed to two very different type of people in these worlds. And so, I feel like that's part of what I do, in life and with my life, both strangely and awesomely is, I think as Tim Mackey has now made famous, I'm sort of a card carrying Bible and language nerd and spend a lot of my time just talking about these things with people, whether they be people in the academy or people in the church. And COVID has just been a lot of that. honestly, and it's been a lot of reading and working and teaching and resourcing and I mean, strange for all of us, we've been on house arrest here in Calgary since about October. And so I'm still on house arrest, doing the house arrest thing. And, but yeah, we live in the heart of the city, and that's where we're endeavoring to do ministry and to plant. And my wife is a therapist here in the city. She has her own private practice. And so she's doing great with that. And so, yeah, we love the city. We've been here for almost 2 years, believe it or not, although again, COVID's about a decade. So like 12 years, we've almost been here now. And we just continue to do the work that we can. And for me personally, the work that I can to help resource people to think more broadly, and I should say more historically, about what it means to be a Jesus follower, and more broadly and historically about the things that Christians think, or followers of Jesus think, about the Bible and doctrines, to hold a broader historical perspective. So that's kind of who I am. That's kind of what we do here in the city.
Yeah. And I think that's so cool and very true of you, where it's like you kind of stand in these two worlds of academic Bible scholar, but then also like being with regular people. Because I usually find that in ministry, it's two ways, where either I read guys who are Bible scholars, and I know that if I were to hand the book to a normal Christian, they would be bored to tears because they just talk like Bible scholars. Or it's just people who are super practical and never really dive super deep. And it's like the books are really easy to read, or like these people are really normal for people to hang out with, but the depth isn't really there. So I like that you balance. I found that you really balance those two worlds really well, where it's like a Bible scholar that I can hand over to someone who's like not wanting to, I don't know, sit around and read a book that bores them to tears about, I don't know, what were Jews like in the early.
I mean, and I appreciate you saying that. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to study with Scott. And I've been really fortunate enough to also be able to study with Nijay. For those of you who don't know, Scott even has a podcast. It's called Kingdom Roots. Listen to this podcast, but then also go listen to some of Scott's. But he's notorious for being, he is truly, and I say this for his benefit, not really for mine, but he's one of the best American New Testament scholars alive right now. And yet he also has been in the church for a long time. He's not unaware of the issues of the church. He's not unaware, much like you and I and your listeners, of what needs to be deconstructed, what might need to be reconstructed. But that doesn't mean that we throw the baby out with the bathwater, as the proverbial saying goes. It means that we actually have to hold a broader historic tension of these things to be able to helpfully critique the things that we see that are not helpful or functional or true of the historic church, but simultaneously not just walk away and abandon everything simply because we're struggling. Because the thing that you find in the history of the church is that while that struggle is very real, and while I don't want to discredit any of your listeners in the struggle that they've had, that struggle is actually part of the journey. And to just say, I don't want to do the struggle anymore, I don't want to keep wrestling with these strange collection of documents that we call the Bible, is actually to do ourselves a kind of disservice, because I actually think that it's created and designed, and whatever language you want to use for that, but it's bound together in such a way that it's meant to be something that we wrestle with. So that's why I'm most excited to be here today to talk to you about what you're doing. And I just want to say I'm grateful that you're doing this podcast, as a friend of yours. And just for the benefit of the listeners, this has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but we're obviously in a moment where deconstruction, going back to that first episode you did with Cal, or the second episode, deconstruction has become a kind of hermeneutical lens. It's become a way in which people interpret and see the world, that everything has to be torn down. And that was not Derrida's intention. That shouldn't be. Our hermeneutic of suspicion is probably hurting us more than it's helping us at this point. And so we have to figure out how to do, what I call good historical sleuthing, to find our way forward in terms of what we believe, what followers of Jesus have believed, and why, in the midst of a very strange moment in human history, a very turbulent moment in human history, we might actually say we continue to take steps forward in following Jesus in spite of challenges. So thank you for doing this. I'm really grateful.
No, the pleasure is all mine. And so I want to dive into that, because I think there are those two camps. There's often people who've never thought about this, or people who have only thought about this, and that's all they spend their time thinking about. And so I want to ask you, what is the Bible and how was it made? Is it just this, I don't know, golden tablets that's fallen from the sky? Is it like this thing that's just superhuman and it's just like another book in the history of the world? Like what is it and how did it come together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, you would know this as well as I would, and your listeners probably know this too. You know, the classic Jewish and Christian confession about the Bible is that it is a divine and human book. So let me say it this way, through these human words, God speaks to humans. So through these human words, God speaks to humans. And so one of the things that I've said, and then I want to get into sort of two extremes on this front. One of the things that I've said for years is that this thing that we call the Bible, the Christian Bible, if you would, is a collection of documents of, you know, varying genres, time periods, and they are in and of themselves a Minority Report story. Interestingly, a story that's being offered by a marginalized people group of color. And I say that because of the context we're in and the way in which those are of course, important things to highlight and talk about. And these collection of documents, they offer us and highlight the interactions that have taken place throughout human history between God, capital D, divine, but for us, we would say Yahweh, manifested in flesh in Jesus of Nazareth, and his people in the space-time universe. Now, that's a very particular way of saying that, but it's in space and time throughout the course of human history. And these documents, interestingly, they're written by particular individuals and sometimes groups of individuals. In fact, oftentimes groups of individuals in particular contexts. So I'll say that again quickly. So a collection of documents that are a Minority Report story of the interactions between God and humanity in the space-time universe. And they were written by particular individuals or groups in particular context. Now, that last part is very interesting too, because these documents were not written in a vacuum. Now, that is just a fancy way of saying they were written in a historical moment. Sometimes they were written in ways that were polemical against other stories. That while the tradition may have existed orally, and this is a story that people had told for maybe thousands of years, oftentimes in the context of the scriptures, some of these documents, when they were penned to make a clear statement, not only of these people's interactions with their God, but that those other competing stories were not true. Yeah. And so that's interesting because even in the context of Genesis 1, and then I'll highlight these two extremes, even in the context of Genesis 1, people will say, oh, have you never heard of the Enuma Elish? And I'm here to say, if you've never read the Enuma Elish, pause, Google Enuma Elish, go read it. It's amazing. I mean, it's this ancient Near Eastern mythos of this Babylonian creation story that has lots of similarities to that of Genesis 1. And I think sometimes what people say is, oh, there are other competing creation stories. And they'll say that means that our creation story isn't true. But I think what they fail to realize is those creation stories are written in a genre, sometimes to say, well, you say these things are true. We say that's not true. These things are true. And so they're written not in a vacuum, but in very particular context. But here's what I find. When people first talk about the Bible, like, what is it? Is it trustworthy? People end up on one of seemingly two ends of the spectrums. So on one end, and I think this is very common in the historical moment that we live in, people will say, well, the Bible is only human. Yeah. It is an ancient artifact of human religious experience. So we have this one end of the spectrum where people have come along and they've realized, and I sort of say realized, that the Bible was written, or this collection of documents was written in a particular historical context over periods of time by human beings. Now, what's fascinating about that is that Jewish and Christian peoples for millennia have said there's a fundamentally human component to these documents. And sometimes the people who end up on this far end of the spectrum where they say, well, it's only human, it's because they grew up, seemingly, a lot of times, I think, in a world in which it was only divine. And so when they find out that there are human elements about these documents, they say, oh, well, if there are human elements, then they're only human elements.
Yep.
And if we have no way of tracking the way these interactions have happened between God and humanity throughout human history, then we just have to throw it all away. The divine stuff can't exist. It has to just be strictly human stuff. And so I think one of the things that I see is something that actually C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, or Oliver O'Donovan would say we need a genealogy for how we have arrived here at this point in human history.
Yeah.
And there's people on this end of the spectrum where they say, well, it's only human, it's only historical, it's accounting this particular people group's religious experiences. But that's a very modern Western post-Enlightenment phenomenon to think about these documents in that way. And I'm only saying that not to criticize anyone listening who thinks about this collection of documents this way. It's just to say, in a broader historical context, you are not the first person to realize that there are human components and elements to this collection of books.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes what happens is, and this is the chronological snobbery piece, is we realize something. I think this is actually a widespread cultural phenomenon right now where we realize something. And I'm not saying any of your listeners are arrogant. I'll use myself as an example. I realize something. And in my arrogance and in my sort of individualistic context, I think I'm the first person to ever realize this. Yeah. And so I start talking about it like nobody knows, like no one has ever realized this. And the problem is when we do that, we're completely untethered from a kind of history that has acknowledged this reality forever, that actually for most of the church's history, people did not take issue with the fact that these were human documents. The early church, let's use them as a primary example here, they understood that there were human elements to these documents. Paul was writing these letters. They knew that. The Gospels emerged in particular contexts. The book of Revelation, believe it or not, in its strange apocalyptic genre, and we'll talk about that later, emerges in a particular kind of context. So these people knew that these documents were written by human beings. So that's one end of the spectrum. Yeah. We have people listening or people for whom they have these conversations and interactions with people where it's like, oh, these are just strictly human documents, and they might be interesting human documents, but they're just human documents about people's religious experience in history. And I might say to that group of people, I might say, well, how do you account for such a widespread, lengthy influence of this collection of documents? Yeah. If they're simply human, why haven't we thrown them out in the way that we've thrown out other strictly human documents? Now, on the other end of the spectrum, I might actually say from my perspective, because I didn't grow up in the church, this other end of the spectrum for me is maybe worse. Maybe that's mean to say, but it's also it's the other end of the spectrum that probably a lot of the people listening to this podcast are either in the midst of this or they're moving away from this. And it's that the Bible is only divine. So on one end, of course, the Bible is only human. On this other end, the Bible is only divine. And for this community of people, it's some kind of sacred behavior manual that dropped out of heaven. Yeah. It just, I've called this for years, the golden tablets view of the Bible. On one end, you have this like human view of like, it's very, very low authority. It's just humans wrote it. On the other end of the spectrum, it's like golden tablets that fell from the sky. Yeah. Now, we have all sorts of problems on this end of the spectrum, because then you're all of a sudden starting to say things about this collection of documents that aren't necessarily true things. One, that it fell from heaven. I mean, no one's saying that, but that's sort of the belief that it just, What's funny about that is that's the Mormon view of the Bible. Yeah. Gold tablet, literally gold tablets, And so the Bible is, of course, not a behavior manual. It's a collection of documents that take the form of a very long story. Some people, some biblical scholars and theologians will also call it kind of a master poem, because it takes on varying genres. But at no point in time is it some kind of behavior manual. The other thing that I find happens a lot is that a lot of Christians talk about it like a reference desk manual. It's we're going to look up this reference. What does it say here? Okay, out of context, here's what it means. And as though these documents don't have a storied nature to them, or that the letter or Paul isn't offering a longer argument than just that one verse. The example I always use here is in 1 Corinthians 8, Paul says, knowledge builds up, but knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. This is an example. And so people will use this and they'll say, oh, you see, knowledge is bad, love is good. And the problem with that is, in the context of the argument, if you keep reading, Paul's saying the knowledge of the freedom that you've received to eat food sacrificed to idols can puff you up, because then you disregard your neighbor and stumble and you don't care. So he's saying love will build them up. Love won't just use its freedom, its knowledge of freedom for its self-gain, but it'll actually use to build the other up. So on the other end of the spectrum is this community and group of people where it's a sacred behavior manual, or it's a desk reference manual. It's fallen from heaven. There's no human component to it at all. It's strictly divine. And the other thing that happened over the course of history, and oftentimes I think, I don't know what you think about this, Aidan, but I think oftentimes some of our greatest issues come from our greatest blunders. So that we actually in turn have created the problems. And so one of the things that I think we did in the sort of B.B. Warfield era, a couple of 100 years ago, is we said, oh no, in a post-Enlightenment world, people are asking these kinds of questions about the human nature of the Bible. And so what we need to do is we need to invent terms that the Bible, by the way, the Bible does not use these terms to describe itself. One of the things that I'm trying to do in my life as a New Testament scholar is to use language of the Bible that the Bible uses to describe itself. So I don't need to create terms to defend the Bible. But this is sometimes what we do. Religious people on both sides of the spectrum, even in our political moment now, on the left and the right, because there's fundamentalism on both sides, is the groups of people will create ideologies, they'll create categories, and they'll say, well, you can't defy this category, and if you do, you're out. Now, of course, we know this. The church invented cancel culture a long time ago by burning people at the stake. It's tongue in cheek, but you know what I mean. But in this sense, then, we came along and we said, okay, we need to make these categories of words. And so we started using the word inerrant and the word infallible. Inerrant, no error. Infallible, it can't be wrong in anything that it teaches, including science, other things, whatever. So I'm not saying that there isn't merit to these categorizations. And for some people listening to this, the heretic barometer is going up because I'm discrediting these words. But this is what we do, is we create this kind of boundary line that's completely fabricated based on words that we decide. So we're trying to defend the Bible. And in trying to defend the Bible, we create these categories. And then people come along and they start deconstructing these categories. And in deconstructing these categories, we're saying, oh, they're deconstructing the Bible itself, but they're not. Those categories need to be deconstructed. And I just want to say this, because I believe this to be true. I have been, both in a pastoral sense, but also in a very Bible scholar, scientific, textual apparatus out, looking at textual variants, thinking about the emergence of what we call the canon. I've thought about all these things. And I'm just here to say this collection of documents that we call the Christian scriptures does not need our defense. It does not need us to make categories to defend it. If it's true, and if God is who this collection of scriptures says that he is, he does not need us to create these very, very unhelpful categories to try to defend him. So what we did was we said the way that we're going to secure the authority of the Bible is creating our own categorizations. So we have these two ends of the spectrum, and on one end of the spectrum, you have people denying the divine aspect of the scriptures, all human, no divine. On the other end, you have all divine, no human, and like many things in life, there is actually a third way. That creating a dichotomy between these two realities doesn't help us. It is not all human. It is not all divine. In fact, these controversies emerged even about Jesus himself. Is he all human? This Philippian ode where Paul says he appeared in the likeness of humanity. And so you get this thing of like, oh, well, then he wasn't really human, he was simply divine. That's what the Arians said. On the other end of the spectrum, people have said very different things. So these two polar opposites, where I just think we have to come back, at least at the beginning of this conversation, like, what is the Bible? Well, the Bible is a very human and a very divine book. These are human words that God speaks to his people through humans. And they emerged over a very long period of time. The other thing I would say is, when you start taking up and trying to read, to sort out, okay, well, what is this? How did they emerge? How are they credible? How do they have authority? There are some really interesting moments, even in the Bible itself, that we all have to reckon with. So the Bible acknowledges, in Exodus chapter, I think it's Exodus 17, verse 14, Moses gets a command from Yahweh to write down what's happened in the context of the history of this people. Moses, as the story goes up the mountain for 40 days. He receives not only the 10 words from God, but he receives far more commands than that. And these get written down, and legislation gets written down. And then you enter into other parts of the scriptures where it talks about how, are these not written in the books of the kings and the history? So there are these documents and manuscript evidence, but then you enter into the prophets, and Jeremiah has Baruch writing down all sorts of things. And then when Baruch goes before the king, what happens? That manuscript gets torn, thrown into the fire, and you think, oh no, was that the inerrant, infallible manuscript of Jeremiah, or was it the next one that was written? And you begin to realize that there are these very human components that the scriptures itself attests to. And so, these things emerged in the context of a few different things. One, and then we can come to another question. One, and I'm just going to use some New Testament language here to describe it. Luke talks about compiling or drawing up these documents together. Anatosomai is the sort of Greek word, anatosomai, and it means to compose or to organize materials into a sequence. So Luke is doing what historians do. He's saying, I am collecting these fragments of documents or these sayings sources. I'm interviewing people about their experiences with Jesus. I'm going to hear their stories. I'm going to compare those stories against other stories. I'm going to compile all this evidence that exists. So that's one example in the New Testament of describing how these things came into existence. Another one is Paul often uses this word Paradidomi, which quite literally means the things that are handed down to us. Or passed on in oral tradition. And so these stories were told and retold and told and retold in such a way that I think modern Westerners have no categorizations for understanding. And I'll come back to why in just one second. Another one is, of course, eyewitness. It's a reference to those who quite literally saw with their own eyes. And the New Testament uses this language. Now, one of the things that happens that's really interesting to me is recently, in about the last decade, there's been this surgence in biblical scholarship around sort of eyewitness testimony and memory, and asking these questions. Well, can we trust eyewitness testimony? Is memory strong enough that people can actually remember the things that were said and the sayings that happened? And what I find really interesting about this line of inquiry is that it uses all modern categories as its way of trying to decide whether or not people 2 millennia ago had the ability to remember sayings and be very strong eyewitnesses, trustworthy eyewitnesses. So what I hear a lot of people saying sometimes about this that I find really fascinating, and is people will say, well, I mean, I'm not a very good eyewitness. I don't really remember things. And I can't remember what I said last week, let alone what I say today. And the problem with using yourself as an example is it's incredibly anachronistic. It's also very self-centered, but I'll push that aside for a second. It's very anachronistic in this sense that you're comparing your culturally situatedness to their cultural situation. So you spend so much time on a screen, which, by the way, is destroying your ability to do anything, but that's fine. More than that, that's just an aside for another day, right? I don't know if you know this, but books are available in print. You can get books in print. I don't know if you know this. You get paper copies of books, and you're like, "What's a book? I've never read one of those." And I'm like, "Oh, tears." Part of the problem is that we are anti-tradition in Western culture. So in a post-Reformation world, but also in the world that we're currently living in, we love to tear everything down. And we're not the kind of people who have sat at the feet of our grandparents and our great-grandparents and heard the stories that are told of old, that these stories that are passed on from generation to generation. But more than that, we're not used to living in a culture where there there aren't all of these technological distractions, that the most interesting things that are happening are forms of history and being present for events and showing up in a world where we don't show up. In fact, that was very common. So the categories we use are very anachronistic in the sense of like, of course, in comparison to modern Western people in 2021, our cognitive abilities, our eyewitness abilities, and our ability to recount certain aspects of stories or traditions cannot be compared to ancient peoples. And I think when we do that, we perform a very unintellectual move, actually, where instead of going back to the history, going back to what's gone on with these people, what do we know about how these people told stories, how these people documented things? That's what we need to do. We need to understand the context of history, not just our sort of present cultural moment. And so these are the things that happen, right? Compiled, they're handed down, eyewitnesses. John even acknowledges in his gospel that many gospels could be written, and many have tried to undertake writing these things. And so these are the things that were going on in that first century context and beyond, is that these documents emerged. And one of the things that's interesting about them is that they sort of were able to carry forward because they had some kind of weight and authority that has nothing to do with what we would call canonization. It has nothing to do with what we would call the printed Bible. It had everything to do with the sort of veracity of the testimony, the authority of those writing these documents. And so they were trustworthy for those kinds of reasons, is that people knew people who knew people who were present for these things. And these kinds of conversations happened. And so they carried that kind of weight of authority. So what is the Bible? At the end of the day, to answer your question, I've given a lot of information, so feel free to clarify and we can come back around to things. The Bible is this collection of documents that are trying to offer a reliable history for their interactions between who they are and who their God is. More than that, they're trying to give an account for what it means to be human. Why do we suffer in the world? They wouldn't put it this way, but like, what is consciousness? How is it that humans are different from animals, that humans rule over creation? How is that? They're giving these stories and these accounts of experiences, and they're talking about wisdom in the way in which that clearly there is something transcendent and other that not only speaks to us, but has infused his wisdom into all of creation. And so these documents are trying to offer this history, and then this history of this God who comes to ultimately liberate this people and push them back towards his intended purposes for them. And so their authority doesn't arise in some sort of magical sense, but their authority derives from, witness and time and tradition, that these people have clung to these stories and these documents. And there are other stories and other documents that were not clung to, that were rejected, that were not part of this core collection of documents. And that happened long before there was ever some kind of council. So we'll come back around to this idea of a council, but I'll just say that the authority of the documents that we have in our scriptures, the authority of those, the Hebrew Bible was settled by the time Jesus of Nazareth walked on the scene. Like, these documents were trusted and collected over time. But then the New Testament, it's actually not very long after. Even we see this in letters from Clement of Rome, that he's actually quoting large swaths of the New Testament in his letters. This is at 95 AD, even before breaking into the end of the first century. Already people are quoting these documents as authoritative, but that's still 300 years before any kind of council. And so when we say, how was the Bible made? Here's the problem with the question. The question assumes that human beings put it together in a very formalized sense. When we think of something being made, we think of, oh, I'm going to go make something now.
Yeah.
But what's actually true, and I hope we can talk about this again later, I'm sure we'll run out of time, but when you look at even the council where they settled on what the canon was, it was less about them picking and choosing which documents they thought were credible, and more about them recognizing which documents had become credible. So that's very different. They're not making the Bible. They're recognizing which documents had been in circulation and had widespread authority. And at that point, they're already trying to sort out like, okay, I guess we need to have a collection of these things.
Yeah.
But the people writing these documents weren't envisioning that they would be collected and bound together. Paul was corresponding with the Corinthians about what it meant to follow Jesus. He wasn't thinking, oh, this is going to end up in some collection of documents for some punk bald guy to read 2,000 years later. That's just not what he was thinking about. At the same time, however, we can say that Paul understood his documents to be authoritative because they were being read in public assembly. So at the end of the day, that's a little bit of a history, and you can ask clarifiers and we can talk about wherever you want to go next. But I think when we think about the Bible being made and people talk about the making of the Bible, it's a bit of a misnomer because it was a very natural process where the recopying of these documents had to happen because they were moving in widespread circulation. And some people were realizing, Matthew, for example, might have thought, Mark was written for this particular community in this context, but we need more gospels. We need more robust accounts. Let's keep writing these biographies. Let's keep circulating. We need more so that we can reach more people with this story. And so it's one of these very interesting things where even the copying of these documents, how and why was it happening? Because there was this phenomena of this human being called Jesus of Nazareth who had turned things upside down. And that was changing everything about Roman power structures, Roman status, Roman hierarchy. And then that was trickling into what we know as Europe. It was just moving across the known world at the time. So much so that Paul can say, the gospel's bearing fruit all over the cosmos. Now, is Paul thinking here, it's bearing fruit in Canada? No, Paul's saying it's bearing fruit all over the known world. And so Paul's talking about the movement of the Jesus tradition and the Jesus story and the way that's impacting communities and playing itself out writ large. That's a pretty 30,000 foot explanation, but I think it gets us started.
Yeah, no, it's good. And I think too, I laugh at the Eyewitness Beer where people are like, well, I can't remember what a conversation I had last week. How can we trust that like Matthew and John are still remembering what happened with Jesus correctly? And it just makes me laugh because I'm like, one, I'm pretty sure that if I was with the Son of God, I would be really trying to remember the things we did. but two, it's also like we don't question things like that in history as well, where it's like the clearest example in Canada is our treaties with Indigenous people, where we had written treaties and they had verbal treaties, and we would show up and we would try to make adjustments to the treaty without them knowing, because we're like, they didn't take a copy of it. How are they going to know if we changed anything? And we'd show up, make some tweaks, and they'd be like, that's not the treaty we agreed on. And then they'd recite the actual treaty and they'd remember it hundreds of years later.
Of course.
And no one questions whether or not the accuracy of the Indigenous people, because we know they were a verbal story passed down culture who actually had the mental capacity, which in all honesty, we as Westerners probably are lacking the mental capacity to remember things like that. Where that claim always makes me laugh a little bit, but it makes me wonder, like, how, before we dive into the next question, like, how can because I've heard it said that it's like, yeah, okay, like, yeah, sure, they could have remembered it maybe. Yeah, sure. But like, how do we know that that's actually what John wrote? How do we know that's actually what Matthew wrote or Luke or Mark? Like, because people will say, we've got all these thousands of manuscripts and they really align. But then some people say, yeah, but we only got like little chunks that are closer to when they were written, and we don't have like the full manuscripts until like a little bit later. And so people feel nervous about that. And like, oh no, what if they're wrong? What if there's huge chunks of Matthew that are just like absolute BS and should be in there? Like, what would you say to someone who's like feeling that uneasiness of whether or not they can trust what's actually in their Bible?
I would say it's a great question. And the other thing I would say to them is, I feel for you, because I think before I started doing, so like I've been reading Greek for 5 or 6 years, maybe a little longer. I'm reading through all the patristic authors in Greek right now. And my wife and I are learning Hebrew together. And so when you are learning these languages, you begin to realize that these things like textual variants and manuscript evidence aren't nearly as scary or daunting as sometimes people make them out to be. There's a kind of fear mongering on like both sides of these strange apologetics on the left and the right, where someone wants to make you very afraid that like this manuscript evidence is somehow not trustworthy, or when you really look into it, they're small fragments of manuscripts, and so we don't really know. But here's what I'll say: when you take and pick up and read the New Testament, for example, in its original languages, you'll see that there's something called the textual apparatus at the bottom. And so it shows you all the manuscript evidence that we have for what's both written in the text, but also anytime there are textual variants. And we actually have, it's a very scientific process, as you would imagine, that we've come up with to know what's original and what's not original. So, you know, for example, widespread attestation is usually the strongest. Like, do we have a large swath of manuscripts that all say the same thing? It's likely at that point that that's what was actually said. More than that, we can see that there are moments where scribes are either trying to change something because they don't like what it says, or they're trying to add information to clarify in a particular direction. Again, that's not scary or daunting. We can tell when that's happening by actually looking at the manuscript evidence. Yeah. From there, I would say we know one of our rules is that the hardest reading is probably the most original reading. So there's more criteria, and I don't need to go through all of them, but when you're doing text critical work, there's actually this whole set of criterion that we're using to try to discern manuscript evidence. Now, there's some points in time where certain things pass through in very strange ways. And part of that is just because of this strange history of translating the Bible into other languages that has emerged in the post-Reformation era. So one of these examples is the pericope adulterae, is what we nerds call it. The woman caught in adultery in John 8 is what normal humans call it. And for those of you who have taken up and read John 8, you would see that it says right before you read it in your English translation, this was not in the most original manuscripts. And that is patently true. In fact, this might surprise some of you, that particular story we find in some of Luke's manuscripts, and we find in varying places throughout John in some of the manuscripts. And the reason why is because the story clearly had such strong traction that people were trying to put it in anywhere because they loved this story of Jesus so much. And I think one of the things that I'm saying here is not that that story didn't happen. It's just that John didn't write it as part of his gospel. So it doesn't belong in John. And that teaches us something really important. And this is the thing about memory that we're coming back to, and about this thing about, oh, they're just small chunks of manuscripts, is that there were all of these different saying sources that were written down about Jesus. Yeah, some of our manuscript evidence is short, but it's also manuscript evidence that precedes the writing. It's earlier than Mark or Matthew, because we have these sort of saying sources. The other thing is we know that there were other sources like Q or other forms of oral tradition where people were circulating these stories. So yeah, we know, we can tell when things are not early. The other example, of course, the other famous one, is the ending of Mark. I mean, somebody decided they were really unhappy with Mark's cliffhanger. I mean, it is a pretty baller way to end a gospel. To say they went in, they saw that there was no body, there was some weird glowing angel thing, and the women ran out terrified and they told no one. And you're like, well, that's very unsatisfactory. And so somebody came along and they thought, I think what we need here is a little bit of snake handling business. So somebody wrote up an ending that includes stuff about how when you handle snakes and bite them, you're going to be fine. That's the weirdest thing. But this is not original to Mark. And so what I'm going to say is that, on one end of the spectrum, people can create this sort of fear-mongering mentality by saying, oh, there are these textual variants, there are these alternative manuscripts. But the problem is we can very clearly tell when it's happening and when it's not happening. And the manuscript evidence we do have for the New Testament in particular, we have somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 manuscripts. That's more than any other document in the ancient world. And we don't question the veracity of like stories about Julius Caesar or other forms of history that were written in that time period, even though we might have 50 manuscripts about it. In this case, we have 5,000. And the reason for this, and you have to understand, in Greek, it's all capital letters and there's no punctuation, no spaces between words. So it's very easy as a copyist to make a mistake. Or to write something in the margins, or to skip a line by accident. And these sorts of things happened all the time, because it's when you think about writing all of Matthew out with no punctuation, no spaces, you're bound to get tired. You're bound to maybe make a few mistakes here or there. And thankfully, because of the criterion we're using, we can figure out pretty quickly what is actually original and what is not original. And the other thing I'll say before you want to ask any clarifying questions is that, you know what, that might actually be it. That's probably good for now. Just that we can tell where there are issues and where there are not issues. And we can tell based on circulation and attestation. And more than that, we know that clearly these gospels that were written were at a pretty early stage, as far as we can tell, and the letters and other things were being copied and rewritten. So some people say, well, we don't even have the originals. And the assumption that's being made, and I think this is the assumption that gets made on both the far right and the far left of this issue, is that one, it's the original manuscripts that are without error, some people will say. And that is a circular argument that almost makes no sense at all. On the other end of the spectrum, people will say, well, we don't have the originals, therefore, who knows if what we actually have here is true. But the people who are copying and writing these things weren't thinking in those terms at all. They were thinking, how do we get the greatest number of copies at the highest amount of circulation? Because we want everybody to hear this radical story of this teacher and rabbi, God made flesh, come amongst human beings, the one who offered himself over to liberate a nation. So these are circulating within communities. They're not thinking, oh, the original one is the best one. They're thinking the most common one is the best one. That's the true one. And I think we have to move back into those categories. It's not about one particular manuscript that we don't seem to have. It's that we have all these manuscripts that give us the ability to say with an overwhelming amount of certainty that this is what it says. And I'm here to say too, the moments where we might not know exactly which one it is, or the manuscript evidence is close, it's usually the difference between like a humes and a chemes in Greek, which is literally the difference between you and we. And it's because it's these moments of one letter of difference. So they're not the things that some people would make them out to be, like your whole faith is compromised on this. And so in that sense, we have a high degree of ability to trust it. Although I don't think that based on the manuscript evidence, the category of trust is something we should be thinking in at all. It's more like, is it true? It's very trustworthy. The issue is not whether or not it's trustworthy. The issue is whether or not it's true. And there's a wrestling match to be had there. And maybe some of the listeners are thinking about, what I'm really wrestling with is whether or not this is true, and whether or not I believe this, and whether or not I want to shape my life around it. And I just want to advise you, talk about that. Don't fixate on whether or not it's trustworthy, because you're using the trustworthiness thing as an excuse instead of actually dealing with the real issue. It's trustworthy. It just is. And I'm not saying that because I am the greatest expert in the world. It's just that I've read experts on this. I've looked at the manuscript evidence. I've looked at the emergence of these documents within their historical moment and merging into the first, second, third, fourth centuries. And they're very trustworthy.
Yeah, and I find I agree with you on that trustworthy point. And that's the funny thing for me too, is I'm like, if these documents are true, like, let's just move past it. Do you not think that the God these documents are talking about is powerful enough to keep moving and make sure that like that Joey who's copying this manuscript doesn't screw it up for the rest? Like, I'm just like, why do you think that if we don't have the exact original from 30 AD that someone wrote, that therefore, oh no, like we'll just never know whether or not this is what Mark actually wanted to write down? And it's like, do you not think that the Holy Spirit, like if the story is true, that the Holy Spirit had the power to keep working through other people to make sure that the story got out?
A lot of theories too, people fixate on when it was written. You know, Matthew is probably written, 70 AD, let's say. And people will say, well, that's, 40 years after Jesus. And I think the thing that they fail to recognize is, well, it's likely that the stories about Jesus were being orally told within that community for quite a bit of time. And whenever the apostolic, which is a fancy way of saying the person who actually saw the events, whoever the eyewitness was, when they were coming to the end of their life, it was likely that at that point in time, these things were written down. The other thing I will say that people use as some sort of an argument that is anachronistic and it doesn't really understand the history. But I think this also is going to cause some people a little bit of discomfort, is they'll say, well, we're talking about poor fishermen and tax collectors and people who would have no ability to write this kind of Greek. And I think the thing that those people fail to recognize is that papyri was very expensive. Something like Romans probably in modern currency would have cost about $2,000 to produce. Papyri is very expensive, but more than that, a lot of times people hired out scribes, people who were trained to write. Because if you had clean writing that was small, you could get more words on a page, so you use less pages, therefore it's less money. And so they would hire scribes to do the writing. And we know this even from Paul's letters. Paul talks about how in Romans, you have this funny moment in Romans 16 where it's like, the guy's like, hey, and by the way, I'm here. I'm the one who's been writing the whole time. What's up, guys? And he just like goes back behind the curtain. Or in Galatians, Paul's like, see, I write now with large letters with my own hands. For me, now this is a debate in New Testament interpretation. I think that Paul is only taking up the pen to write at that moment. I think he's been dictating up until then. So it's a misnomer to say these people weren't smart enough to know this kind of Greek, because it's likely that they had someone else doing the writing for them. And they were offering corrections, clarifications, telling the story. And we're talking about communal writing and communal interpretation. Again, we live in a world of individualists. We all talk about how Paul wrote all these letters, but then we never talk about how also, oh, this is Silvanus, Paul, and Timothy writing this letter. Or this is Peter's talking about who he's writing with, and John Mark is here with me. And Paul's like, oh, Phoebe's here, and say hi to Demas. Demas is here too. And so a lot of these documents, at least this is what we're thinking in sort of modern current scholarship, is that they were much more communally written than they were written by sort of one single individual. And so with that, then you have a higher ability to ensure that these things are being spoken of correctly, that the writing is happening in the right kind of way, because it's not just one individual. More than that, I mean, Paul was a master rhetorician. And honestly, for his day, a genius. And we know this just because of how he was trained and who he was and his education. And his rhetoric is comparable to that of Cicero or other authors and writers of the time. Like this guy was no joke. So I just say that too, people use these funny one-sided arguments that I think are not rooted in history. But these things are trustworthy for sure.
Yeah, well, and I just want to comment on that a little bit, where it's funny because I've heard that said about like Matthew and John. Well, not John more, because John kind of does his own thing, but especially Matthew, where it's like, if you were an eyewitness, why would you be basing some of your biography off of like Mark in this Q source? Like, why would you not? Which to me is funny, because it's like we do that with modern day biographies, and no one's sitting around being like, whoa, this guy's why is he making sources? Like, what's wrong with this? Like, Mark's already done the work, and he's like, okay, I'll take some of this and some of Q and work on it. So that I always find is a funny argument.
Matthew is of course expanding, right? Matthew and Luke, there's clearly evidence of other source materials that they're using. But then, so Helen Bond just recently released a book. She is an incredible professor in the UK. She teaches at Edinburgh. She's one of the greatest New Testament scholars in the world. She just released a new book not that long ago on Mark as biography. And it's a pretty helpful defense again of reading the Gospels as ancient bioi. And one of the things about this category of bioi, and this can maybe transition us into our next question. Maybe we'll only get through 2 questions today, but is that bioi has a particular genre and way that it functions. It's not simply history in the way that we sometimes think about history. You've heard the old adage, there's no such thing as a fact. You know what I mean? Because a fact is always incorporated into some kind of story. So you have to figure out, okay, where's the fact? What's the story? How is this being storied? And how is the material being ordered? So each of the gospel writers, including John, has a particular intention and purpose in writing for us. They're trying to communicate particular things. So a good example of this is Matthew includes this thing we now call the Sermon on the Mount. It's funny, even people who know that, it's on Sermon on the Mountain. You know what I mean? Like I've said this before, and people are like, oh yeah, I've never thought about how mount is short for mountain. I'm like, yeah. Mark doesn't include this material at all. And Matthew does. And so clearly it emerges from somewhere else, same sources. And here's what we know. And here's what most scholars would say is that Jesus did not preach this sermon in one go on the side of a mountain. And we know this because Matthew is very, we might in modern parlance call him OCD. He's ordered all of Jesus's teaching materials in thematic blocks. It's like all of a sudden Jesus gives his discourse on life in the kingdom, and then Jesus talks about parables, and then Jesus talks about community, and then Jesus talks about judgment, and these 5 blocks of teachings that have clearly been organized by Matthew. Jesus is an itinerant teacher. He probably traveled the backwaters of Galilee. He had these sayings he would use in every city, but then sometimes maybe new materials. And we know this as preachers. Sometimes you reuse materials and you reuse them in slightly different ways. And so all of this is being compiled and offered to us in a kind of package. And that's a very typical convention of bioi, that the materials that strike us as different, it's not laziness. It's that Matthew's like, oh yeah, this material from Mark is good, I'm going to put it here. And there are moments, this might frustrate some people that I'm going to say this, there are moments it's very clear where Matthew's like, I'm going to fix Mark's grammar here because his grammar is really bad. Mark's Greek is very bad in places. Like he's not, whoever wrote it wasn't the greatest Greek writer. Matthew clearly cleans it up. Matthew's Greek is far better. And then Luke does similar things where he takes parts of Matthew, he takes parts of Mark, but then other stories as well. And so we know this, we call this the synoptic problem, is what we call it as Bible nerds. And it's how do these 3 interact together? But then also, how does John play into this? And what is this crazy guy John doing over here? And so we do something called redaction criticism. And this has been done where we have swaths of work that show where these overlap and where they differ. And we use this then to get in some ways behind the text to say, where are we seeing source materials and how are these source materials being used? But that notion of compiling source materials, like you pointed out a minute ago, is so common. That's how we do history. That's how we write stories. We compile stories about someone like Eugene Peterson, to use a modern example. I think his biography is coming out this month or has come out. And this biographer is looking at what? Sermons, books, letters, interviewing people, compiling all of this information in order to give an account of this human being's life. And this is how these things work. That's how they operated both then and now. But the conventions of biography were different in some ways in the ancient world than they are now. But that's a question of genre.
Yeah, no, and I want to dive into that. And I think that your example of, and it'll make the people who see the Bible, it'll make both parties uncomfortable. The people who think the Bible is just human stuff will be like, oh, look, all of the stories are all over the place and in different orders. Therefore, Bible's not true. Or it'll make the people who think it's like golden tablets falling down from heaven become really nervous because they'll be like, what? You're telling me this isn't like a literal biography of Jesus and they're moving stuff around to make points? And I think that both of those are funny to me. And I talk about this with Mark Clark in an episode that'll come out later than this one, about how when we watch shows like Chernobyl or even like the Steve Jobs movie that came out with Michael Fassbender, like I've read the Steve Jobs biography and I know his story really well. And the movie takes chunks of his life and like things he was going through and like always puts it before like a keynote event where he's going to release this big product. And it's funny because I watched the movie with my parents once and they're like, wow, why are they always having these crazy discussions right before they're about to present the new iPhone or something? It's like, well, because obviously it's not, the storytellers are they want you to see Steve Jobs' life and like real things that happened, but they're putting it in this moment because they're actually telling you a story. Yeah. And that doesn't make us uncomfortable. But then all of a sudden when it comes to the Bible, we're like, oh, I don't know. Like in Chernobyl does the same thing where like they tell you at the end of the TV show, they're like, some of these things happened earlier or they didn't happen exactly this way. And we kind of like put it together to make sense with each episode. And it's like, that doesn't bother us because that's what you do. I mean, but for some reason,
I think that's a perfect example, Aidan, of the way in which these ancient writers and thinkers were putting together these materials. They're writing for a particular community, probably originally. And they're writing with particular aims and purposes, things that they each want to communicate, some of which are overlapping in the same way that the book and the movie overlap, and some of which are divergent, not in the sense of like they're not true, but in that, like you're describing, we want to emphasize something differently. So we're going to put this moment here because it naturally leads into this moment. So a good example of this, and then we can move on, is in John's gospel, Jesus cleanses the temple in chapter 2. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus cleanses the temple late in his life. Actually, just before the Passion Week. Jesus is going to cleanse the temple. Now, you have to ask one of two questions. Are there two temple cleansings? Or has John moved the temple incident because he wants to put a different incident in that place as a high point? And the answer, John has moved the temple incident. Now, what is John's high point incident? It's raising Lazarus from the dead. So in the Synoptic Gospels, the Synoptic authors are going to say, this is one of the motivators for them wanting to plot to kill Jesus. He cleanses the temple. But in John, one of the motivators is he raised Lazarus from the dead. And so John is highlighting a different facet of something that was also happening in the life of Jesus. And he wants to put greater emphasis on this because it serves the rhetorical purposes of his gospel. So neither one is more or less true. The events happen. It's the way we order, structure, and tell those events. And you know this as well as I do. Stories have a life of their own, and we use them in different ways and in different contexts. So I might use a story about my life to make a point about this thing on the left, but then I might use the same story to make a very different point, but the story's the same. It's just the point that emerges out of that story is slightly different. So a good example of this, and then I'll stop, is the parables of Jesus get used by Luke in very interesting ways at times, and they serve the purposes of the sort of rhetorical aims that he's trying to accomplish in writing this biography. And sometimes, and this is going to sound scandalizing to some people, but sometimes you end a parable and then Luke's like, and that was a parable about forgiveness. You're like, that story didn't say anything about forgiveness. And Luke is using these stories to try to make theological points. And Jesus only told so many stories, so he has so many stories to work with. You know what I mean? And so it's one of these interesting things where we have to allow the genre of these documents and not we put our expectations on them and they have to function the way that we think that they need to.
Yeah. No, that's good. And so I think that this episode, you got two Bible nerds together talking about the Bible. So I think this is going way longer than we anticipated. So this is probably going to have to be more than one part. So I'll probably land the plane here on this episode with this question. It's like, okay,
sure.
So we've looked at all the Bible and how it was formed and like how humans and God work together to construct this thing to like help people understand and better know who Jesus is and the story that's being told throughout history. So now what do we do with it? Because in the Western world, especially, I've found that actually a lot of this deconstruction comes from a poor reading of scripture. So then how are we supposed to read the Bible? Like, how can we make sure we're reading it correctly? Is it all just literal? Is it all just a bunch of moral fiction? Is it something else?
Right.
How should we actually be reading this story that's been put together?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, to come back to the Steve Jobs example with the film versus the book, you ask, oh, did this literally happen? And the answer is like, well, yeah. But then when you say, right, but it's kind of out of order. And then I could say, that means it didn't literally happen. Yeah. So this is the sort of conundrum I think sometimes we enter into with the Bible itself. And I think one of the things that has happened is because this collection of documents, this like story is bound together, we've learned, and it's learned because it's also a slightly more recent phenomenon. Because when you read the church fathers, they did not have the problems that we have in some of the ways that we're wrestling through our reading. But we have this very flat reading, a very democratized reading of the Bible. And the Bible is not flat in at least two directions. One, the centerpiece of the scripture is Jesus. John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was very God. That means that Jesus is the self-expression of God himself. That means that every word that's been spoken by God is a word that Jesus has spoken. Jesus, that actually means that in terms of the divine aspect of our inspiration, not only the New Testament is written by Jesus, but also the Old. And that's probably people are like, whoa, I don't know what's going on anymore. But the point is this, is that there are particular ways and conventions that we should be reading these documents, not flat. So it's not flat in that Jesus is the centerpiece, but also not flat in that we have to know the genre of literature that we're reading. Yeah. So I often use this trilogy of things that we sort of need to work with at all times. One is we need historical study when we're coming to the Bible. So what is the historical context from which this particular section of scripture that I'm reading, where does it emerge from? And then the second aspect, of course, is a kind of literary study. How is this document? What are its literary features? What are the conventions of the genre of literature that I'm reading? And then, of course, the last one is theology. How does this play into these questions of God and humanity and existence and suffering? So these three components, these converge, and we need all three of them in order to read really well. So here's an example. People will say, oh, I read the Bible literally. And I will open to the teachings of Jesus. And Jesus says, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. And then I just make a very smug remark about how they seem to have both hands. So clearly they don't read this passage literally. And it is rude. Some of you hopefully are laughing, but I'm trying to make a point here to say, okay, so we could admit then that you don't read all of it literally. There's this adage amongst scholars and some pastors where we'll say, oh, we don't read the Bible literally, we read it literarily. And I think that's become somewhat of a trope in some ways, but I do think that it's true that the category of literal is, again, a very unhelpful misnomer. Like when you tell a story that happened in your life, but you're spinning it in such a way that it's going to be funny, it still happened that way. You're spinning it in such a way that it's going to be funny. I mean, this is what comedians are brilliant at. They say things about the world that turn the category on its head. So I would say, like, we have to know what genre of literature we're reading. So let me use a few examples. Let's start, of course, with this idea of just history. Even historical writings in the ancient Near Eastern world have conventions. You know this. When you have to write, I don't know if you're a student or if you work at a law firm, or I don't know where you have a broad spectrum of listeners, but when you're writing something, there are particular conventions for this, like English paper you're writing versus, I don't know, some sort of binding contract versus this or that. And each of those have their own conventions. There are do's and don'ts. And so even to use Joshua as an example, the book of Joshua, we would say, well, this is part of the historical books. It's what we nerds call Deuteronomistic history. And yeah, it is. That's very true. But this kind of history that Joshua is writing has conventions. And warfare narratives, for example, have conventions. Some of those conventions are universalization, hyperbolization, just to use a few Asians, And so that means that when ancient peoples wrote warfare texts, they universalized the texts. We destroyed everybody. It's a kind of ancient propaganda, isn't it? Our people are the ones who caused the greatest amount of destruction. So there's a universalization, but there's also a hyperbolization. No one was left living. We annihilated everybody from the land. And for those of you who keep reading Joshua, you're like, right, but how is it that later you see that they didn't annihilate everybody from the land? And people are like, that's a contradiction. The Bible is incoherent. And I understand why you think that, because you're not used to reading ancient Near Eastern history. But this is how ancient Near Eastern history works. It's these warfare narratives that are being offered, that are making statements, and you have to get behind sometimes what it's saying. Like, what is it trying to communicate to us? Well, it's trying to communicate that, like, they plummeted their enemies, for example. Now, this isn't a conversation about violence in the Hebrew Bible. Thankfully, we have no time for that. But so let's set that aside for a minute. It's just to say that this is a convention of the genre. The Psalms, which, to quote John Mulaney, is a song, but it's just harder to say. It's a psalm. I just love that joke. It's a terrible joke, but it makes me laugh every time. These are Israel's prayer book, Israel's song book. And so they're a kind of poetry. And you know as well as I do that poetry has to be read a certain kind of way. Yeah. When it says that Yahweh sits enthroned on the praises of his people, no one's thinking that Yahweh is somehow sitting on praises that people speak. No one's thinking that.
Yeah.
So then there's a convention of the genre that we have to understand, that Yahweh does such and such with slings and arrows. Well, it's when Malachi says, for example, that when the Son of Righteousness rises with healing in his wings, that we're going to skip out of the stalls like calves. No one thinks that we're going to become a calf, or that we literally have to skip. It's that this is a sort of convention in a genre. Proverbs are easy. They're pithy sayings. One of the ways, though, that people go wrong with Proverbs is they just try to read all of them. And you can't sit down and read the book of Proverbs from beginning to end. A proverb, the wisdom of Proverbs is that you have to know which proverb to use at which time. And so these are sayings that we learn. The book of Job, I mean, it's so unique in the ancient Near Eastern world, probably one of the oldest pieces of literature we have in the Hebrew Bible. And this interesting thing about suffering and covenant, you know, Ecclesiastes, also wisdom literature. But then we get into something like the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And we have to ask, is this that we are reading? And we're not reading, again, I think I've already been dismissive of this in the conversation about Joshua. We can't say this is history in the way that some of us have described it as history. And people in Jewish and Christian history have not been uncomfortable with that idea. The best category for Genesis 1 to 11 is either wisdom literature or what some scholars call mythos. And mythos, we get the word myth from this. And the sort of modern problem with the word is myth means not true. But mythos in the ancient world means something that is so profoundly beyond true that it transcends all space, time, and cultures. So it's something even deeper. And so this is one of the categorizations. But to say, should we read Genesis 1 literally, defies the literary features and aspects and the theological features and aspects of the book. And then it causes us to read these documents in such a way that it defiles them. And so we can't set the terms of conditions for the Bible. We have to come to it, and we have to allow it to be what it is as we read it. A couple more, of course, we talked about Bioe. Paul's letters are letters, and that's okay. They're not theological treaties. We need to think of the letters more as Paul working out how the story of Jesus and the Christ event is working itself out in individual communities. And that's what's beautiful about what Paul's doing, Aidan, is like, if you were to write to me about what's going on in your church and ministry context, it would be a very Pauline thing to do. I thank God for you and the grace that has been bestowed to me because of you. I have these little twerps that will not stop asking me these challenging questions, you know, whatever it is, you know, it's, you know, there's a convention to this, right? And then Hebrews is a very interesting form of literature. We think it was some kind of synagogue homily, but then we end up at the end of the story. And, you know, Aidan, you know this, I feel like I can say it here. I've been working on a book with Scott on Revelation. And so I've been, you know, eyeballs deep in apocalyptic literature for about a year. And again, like, we have to understand, what is this document and how can it be read on its own terms in terms of the history it emerges from in the Roman world, the literary features and aspects of it, and then the theological component. So I'll just say this, and then, you know, we can land the plane. If that all sounds really hard to you, good. And I don't say that in any sort of arrogant way. I say it in the sense that, like, one of the things that someone told you at one point in your life, listener, was that the Bible's really easy to understand. You just take up and read it and you apply it to your own life, and it's super simple and everybody should be able to understand it. And anybody who tells you that it's complicated is like either a heretic or a liar. So just don't listen to them. And you've grown up to realize that this collection of documents is profoundly challenging. And much like Jacob wrestling with the Lord, it's painful. Yeah. And I just want to say that, and I'm channeling a theologian I really love here called Chris Green. He wrote a book called Sanctifying Interpretation. And I just want to say that there's something in wrestling with it that is supposed to happen. I actually want to say that in our current context with the documents we've received, it's supposed to be not only meditation literature that you sit with over long periods of time and you reflect on and you meditate on, but more than that, it's meant to be something that you wrestle with and you say, I dislike this. And the scripture says back to you, good, keep wrestling. And I think that if we can actually continue to wrestle, whatever the issue might be, it's violence in the Hebrew Bible, or it's the genre of the first few chapters of Genesis, or whether it be what someone has told you about what the Bible teaches about women, or whether it be stuff that the scriptures teach about sexuality, or dare I say about apocalyptic literature, which people have monopolized in all sorts of very strange directions, very strange directions. I just want to say that there's an invitation that I think is extended to us to be the kind of people who don't just say, it's just human, it's pointless, I'm leaving it behind, or it's some magical book that fell from heaven, but it's somewhere in between these things. And it's inviting me to just wrestle with it. And to not just choose to say that it's some old archaic thing that doesn't mean anything anymore, because people for millennia have been passing down these stories. They've been preserving these documents. Dare I say, people have died, and they have, so that these documents can be in our hands. And so I think one of the things we need to do with them is we need to say, okay, these documents are really hard. The Bible is confusing and hard to understand. And I am actually going to lay aside the belief that it should be easier. And instead, I'm going to say, I'm just here to wrestle with it. And sometimes I'm going to read it and be more confused than when I went in. And other times I'm going to read it and feel as though there must be something divine coming through these words. Yeah. And the other thing I would say, whether you're a Christian or whether you're not, or whether you're somewhere in between, or you're just one who is wrestling. And let me say, the opposite of faith is not doubt. Faith involves doubt. I think the opposite of faith is shame. Personally, faith and doubt are one and the same. Faith and wrestling go together. Also, faith is a manifestation of the Spirit, according to Paul. So some people do just have it more than others because God is working in them in that way. So I would just say, we got to keep the wrestle and be willing to come through to the other side without just deciding that we want to throw it away. And I don't blame you. So wherever you are on the spectrum, anywhere in between, the other thing is just ask God to speak to you. And this can go wrong in all sorts of ways. But the reason why I say this, because I think so many people's, now I'm talking very church language here, but so many people's doctrine of Scripture doesn't talk about the Holy Spirit. And I think it's a huge problem, because Paul says the letter kills, but the Spirit brings life. And so for Paul, we need to read these things in community with not only the Trinitarian community of faith, hope, and love, but with other people. So it's the last thing I'll say, and I don't know if you have any clarifiers in the way you want to land it, Aidan, but may we all read this book traditionally. And by that, I mean, may you know that you need to read it not only with other people in your context. Don't read the Bible alone. The individual devotional life is fine. Like, read it, but then talk to other people about it, read it with people, and then read it in a chorus of voices that exist throughout human history. Read men and women from the 1st century and the 3rd century, and read the mystics. Please take up and read the mystics. Read Saint Teresa of Avila. The way that she reads the scriptures is so beautiful. Like, read these voices. So have a context with friends, with the Trinitarian community of faith, hope, and love, and then with the saints who have come before us for millennia, because we cannot read it on our own. The adage is that we need to stand on the shoulders of giants, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah, no, Cody, this is so good. I think we've run out of time for this episode, even though I have more questions for you, and we'll probably just expand it in a couple of weeks. So thank you for doing this. I think it's super helpful for both sides. Whether you're someone who's coming out of a more fundamentalist way, seeing the Bible as golden tablets, or someone who's completely deconstructed and think it's nonsense, I think this conversation is going to help a lot of people. So thank you. This has been awesome.
Thank you, man. I'll look forward to the next time, and I really appreciate you having me.